Go ahead and get started. Welcome to the afternoon session, Psychology in the Courtroom, Lawyer Performance and Judging. We have two speakers here for you today. Unfortunately, one of our speakers, Nicole Negawetti, was snowed in and unable to join us. But we had two other individuals who were able to escape the cold clutches of the northeast. So I'm sure you're enjoying the sunny weather today. First up, we have Julie St. John, who is an assistant professor at the University of Detroit Mercy School of Law and part of the Canadian-American dual JD program with the University of Windsor. And she is speaking about the sport of lawyering using visualization to improve performance. So let me turn this over and let me say, let's hold off on questions until we've had both speakers talk, and then we'll have a opportunity at the end. Thanks.
Well, thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm glad that so many of you made it back after lunch today, so I thank you for that. And I'm most thankful to be out of the cold and the snow, and it's been an absolutely brutal winter, so I'm thrilled to be here. Just hoping that my voice holds out, in that it's been a brutal winter for snow and snows. I'd like to preface my comments with first my apologies to the cognitive psychologists in the room for obvious reasons, enough said. And second, with a couple of caveats that first, this is a work in progress. It's not a fully articulated paper. It's something that I've just recently been engaged in. And second, unlike many of the incredibly uber-talented folks that we heard from this morning, I haven't conducted any empirical research of which I speak. Rather, I have engaged in a review of the literature and of the fascinating research that others have done. And I'm attempting to apply that body of knowledge to a different context, and specifically to the legal context, to lawyers, and based on my focus, to law students. So first of all, we know that the brain is a powerful simulation machine. And as we know, you may have heard of some of the visualization that this comes from sports psychology. So sports professionals and amateurs alike are well aware of the advantages of mentally rehearsing a movement prior to its execution. And it's not surprising that this phenomenon, and known as motor imagery, has already been extensively investigated. But what hasn't been investigated is its application in other realms. And what about if we want to improve non-motor skills? Again, through the brain simulation function, but rather than mentally rehearsing physical skills, what if we simulated other skills, such as those used by lawyers and law students? One of the ways that the brain produces this powerful simulation function is through imagery. And so one of the difficulties in wading through some of this research is that there are all of these different terms that are bandied about, and some of them used interchangeably when they are sometimes they're the same, similar, different, and whatnot. First of all, I'd just like to start with a general introduction to imagery. And in fact, you may have used imagery, but didn't realize that that was what you were doing, that it was characterized as such. So if you've ever worried about the future, if you have ever reminisced about the past, if you've ever made plans, or if you've ever had fantasies, then you've used imagery. And so that brings me to some of the terms that we're going to be talking about. First, images are essentially sensory-based thoughts. That the thoughts that you can see, hear, smell, and taste. And so closely related to images is imagery, and that is, imagery has been described as a natural yet special way of thinking that involves our senses. It is a type of thinking that can have a particularly strong effect on our emotions. So here's a demonstration. Imagine the face of someone that you love, think about someone that you deeply care about, and think about the feelings that come with that image. Close your eyes and think about that, and what feelings, what emotions does that evoke? here is that images and imagery are closely related to emotions. And yes, admittedly, I love the term that I heard this morning, that's quite gooey. It's, sort of that touchy-feely way out there stuff, but there's some more concrete, physiologically based examples. And so, while imagery can have a strong effect on our emotions, it can also have a strong effect on our physiology. And so a more concrete example, a more concrete demonstration, is, please bear with me, close your eyes, and think about walking into your kitchen. And you are walking up to the fridge, and you put your hand on the door. I don't know about your fridge, mine is stainless steel, so I'm envisioning what the handle is going to feel like. And I open the door and I can feel the coolness that comes from the fridge. And that I'm reaching into the fridge and I'm taking out a bowl that is filled with lemons, cut lemons. And I'm picking up one of the lemons and I can smell the citrus scent. And I put it in my mouth and I'm sucking on the most sour lemon I have ever tasted. And so hopefully if you've come along with this journey with me, that has triggered your salivary glands. You're envisioning, you're visualizing sucking on that lemon and you've started to salivate. So that's a concrete example of how images and visualization affects our physiology. So to me, that's a little bit less out there, that's a little bit more gooey. It's sort of a concrete demonstration of how powerful this can be. So we've talked about images, we've talked about imagery, and there's a distinction between some of the different types of imagery. First of all, what some of the literature refers to as mental imagery. So mental imagery is like perceiving, but in the absence of the appropriate external stimulus, and can occur in any sense mode. So what does that mean? Perceiving, but in the absence of the appropriate external stimulus. So it's the visions, the images that we use, just the mental imagery. Contrast that with what is referred to as motor imagery. And motor imagery entails imagining motor execution, so imagining movement. So motor imagery requires the mental representation of an overt action without any concomitant movement. So what you are doing is you are envisioning movement, but without actually physically moving. And this is what many of the sports psychology has focused on. So we know that athletes, particularly elite athletes, engage in very extensive practice and rehearsals. And what sports psychology has added to this is not just the actual physical practice, but they've also engaged in the mental practice. So essentially practicing their sport, whether it be diving, whether it be karate, whatever the sport is, it's envisioning and using mental images of exerting that physical action. And in some of these studies, they have actually found that it has energized it. There's been responses in the actual muscles that were involved in the visualization. Now, some of the other terms that are used also are guided imagery. And this is essentially a process where you are asked to focus on images that are selected to help you achieve certain goals. So guided imagery, there has been some further application beyond sport. Oftentimes you'll see this in smoking cessation types of therapy. And so guided imagery is essentially imagery where someone else is walking you through it. It could be a live therapist, it could be tapes, it could be scripts that you read, but it's certain information that you are walked through. And then this gets us into some of the little bit more touchy-feely sort of areas, which gets into meditation, focusing the mind for the purposes of relaxation or for making positive changes. And all of these things really are sort of interrelated in that they are all drawing on some of the similar processes in the mind that in order to affect their success. So one of the problems is that there are numerous terms that are used interchangeably. And when I say in my using visualization to improve performance, that's really sort of a short form for when I refer to visualization, I'm actually referring to both the visualization, the mental imagery, and the mental practice or the mental rehearsal that goes along with it. And so what we're talking about really is the cognitive rehearsal of a task prior to its performance. And so we've seen some really fascinating studies that have come out of, there's been numerous studies that have come out of sports of how athletes, and particularly elite athletes in the time of Olympics particularly, this is a very timely topic, how they have used visualization and this mental rehearsal to improve their performance. There have been some expansion and applying it to other areas as well. And the first, I picked just a couple to illustrate. The first one is the medical students and their surgical techniques. And this was a study that was carried out in 2008 on medical students. So on top of their usual training, which does include the physical practice of the surgical techniques, half were trained in mental imagery techniques, while the other half just studied their textbooks. So the traditional learning pedagogy. And so when the students actually came to carrying out live surgery, so I'd love to be the guinea pig on the operating table that day, but when they actually got to live surgery, the students that had used the mental imagery had performed better on average than those who had been assigned to just the book learning. So I thought that was fascinating because we're taking it out of the sports realm. We're still talking about this motor skills, but it's being expanded to other areas. Another one that I thought was particularly interesting was that what I refer to as powerful pinkies. And so this is a great example from a simple study in which participants trained a muscle in their little fingers using just the power of mental practice. So in this 2004 study, participants were split into 4 groups. Those people performed the mental contractions of their little finger. In other words, they imagined exercising their pinkies. In the second group, it was the same as the first, but they performed mental contractions on their elbows, not their little fingers. In the third group, they did no training at all, and in the fourth group, they carried out physical training on their little fingers, so the actual physical training. So they all practiced, or not, the third group did nothing at all, in their various ways for 4 weeks. And afterwards, the muscle strength in their fingers and elbows was tested. So unsurprisingly, those who'd done nothing hadn't improved, while those who trained physically improved their muscle strength by an average of 53%. The 2 mental practice groups obviously couldn't beat the physical training. I think that'd be just unheard of, but what I found was really fascinating was that they did surprisingly well. That those imagining flexing their elbow increased their strength by 13.5%. And those imagining flexing their little finger increased their strength by 35%. So fascinating to me that just imagining a movement can give you, physical improvements. So this brings us to some of the theories of how imagery and visualization works. One of the earliest theories was the Psychoneuromuscular Theory. And here it posits that imagery rehearsal duplicates the actual motor pattern that is being rehearsed, and that such imagery strengthens the neural pathways for these movements. So essentially, when you imagine performing a particular sports skill, your muscles fire in the same sequence as if you were actually performing the skill. That's one of the early theories. Then another theory that emerged was the symbolic learning theory. And so this differs from the psychoneuromuscular theory in that rather than imagery working due to muscle activation, mental imagery provides the opportunity to practice the symbolic elements of the motor task. So that is, imagery may function as a coding system in the brain to help athletes to form a plan or mental blueprint. Imagery strengthens the mental blueprint, enabling the actions or the movements to become more familiar or possibly automatic, was the ideas of this theory. Next was the bioinformational theory. So since images are composed of certain stimuluses and responses, imagery and imagery rehearsal involves a network of coded stimulus and response propositions stored in long-term memory. For example, the texture and feel of a basketball in one's hand, coupled with the fluid motion of making the free throw. That would be an example of the bioinformational theory. And so the stimulus propositions describe the content of the scenario to be imagined, and the response propositions, on the other hand, describe the imager's response to that scenario. So moreover, an image contains a motor program which includes instructions for the imager on how to respond to the image. And so really, under this theory, the image was thought of as a template for over-responding. And then this brings us finally to what I think to be, so far what my research has uncovered, is the generally accepted sort of current theory of the triple code model. And what this involves is that the model suggests that mental practice is made up of three components: the imagery of the act itself and the manner in which the individuals interact with the image as if they were acting in the real world, the meaning, which refers to the way the performer understands how the motor skills should be done, and the somatic response the individuals have when they become aware of what is required. Next, what I was going to cover, but I noticed that I'm out of time, is that what has recently been proposed as a model for how to utilize imagery, and that has been applied in different contexts, is what's referred to as the Petzler Model. And it involves physical, environmental, task, timing, learning, emotion, and perspective aspects to it. And what I'd like, in just closing, is that while this has really taken shape in the form of sports psychology, there have been some really promising studies. Most recently, there was a study that was done that is entitled "Using Mental Fitness Skills to Enhance Mental Health, Psychological Resilience, and Stress Hardiness in First-Generation College Students." And what these researchers did was they took a number of strategies. They called it mental fitness skills, and it included imagery as one of those skills. And they taught these to the first-generation college students who have traditionally struggled in their first year in university or college. And that the preliminary reports are very encouraging. And where this has led me to is that it has practical application to law students in general, and particularly to preparation for bar exam. It has application to lawyers in the courtroom, visualizing how a particular oral argument will go, how a particular negotiation will go, so forth. So thank you for your time.
Next we have Larry Cunningham, who is here from St. John's Law School in New York. He is the Associate Academic Dean there and Associate Professor of Legal Writing. And before joining the faculty at St. John's, he was a prosecutor in Bronx, New York, and in Alexandria, Virginia, two very different locations. And today is speaking on using principles from cognitive behavioral therapy to reduce nervousness in trials, oral arguments, and other court appearances.
Thank you. And it's nice to be with all of you today. Like Julie's presentation, mine is a work in progress as well, so I'm eager to hear feedback when we get to the Q&A session. Part of my background too, before I became Associate Academic Dean at St. John's, I was the Dean of Students. And I frequently encountered law students who were displaying signs of nervousness and anxiety, and working with them and helping them to make referrals. And this research and this talk grew out in large part from that experience, as well as my experience in teaching first-year legal writing as well as advanced appellate advocacy. And so what I want to talk about today is really three things. First, the importance of oral advocacy as a lawyering skill. Second of all, how nervousness and, if it's elevated enough to anxiety, can impact or serve as an impediment to effective lawyering. And then finally, how cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, principles can be a tool to help reduce nervousness. So, particularly as a legal writing professor, I'm often talking about the importance of writing as a critical skill. But verbal communication as well is really critical. And not just for litigators, but even transactional lawyers have to make presentations to a board or to engage in a negotiation. And for litigators, it can be particularly stressful and particularly important as a skill. In that so much of litigation is not only the written word, but also what you do in court, particularly for areas of law that are primarily litigated in the courtroom as opposed to in written filings. And here I'm thinking specifically of criminal law and family law. Yes, there are criminal motions and family law motions. They tend to be fairly rote and form-based. And a lot of what actually happens is in court. And in-court experiences, I think it's so apropos that we are here in a moot court room, a beautiful moot court room, I should add. But to think about the stresses that occur in a courtroom setting. In trials you have objections and a motion for mistrial, and I want sanctions against that lawyer. And I was a prosecutor, and there were more than a couple of disruptive defendants who would lunge after a witness or lunge after the prosecutor. All of those, and think about cross-examination and how stressful and it gets the testosterone pumping and everything. Appellate arguments too. I was primarily an appellate lawyer in the Bronx. Very, very stressful appearance. Lots of people in the courtroom to watch you. The arguments themselves are short and they're intense, and the judges are grilling you, and it can be an uncomfortable experience. And the very first introduction to this skill that many of our students get is either the Socratic dialogue in a first-year course, or their own appellate oral argument as a part of a moot court exercise in first-year legal writing, which is usually compulsory. And so it's not surprising that exercise can be very it causes a lot of nervousness in students or in speakers. Yet we know that for some people, that nervousness goes a step further, and it goes into anxiety. The fear of public speaking is often listed as one of the top phobias, along with spiders and snakes and confined spaces and getting on an airplane. So, yet we know that a full 10% of the population will experience some form of anxiety, clinical anxiety, in the course of their lifetime. Studies on law students have shown that number for law students can creep up into the 40s, 40%, sometime in their first or their second or third year of law school. Now that's a separate chicken and the egg problem. Are we, law schools, causing that on students, or are students bringing some predisposition with them? Anxiety disorders are, of course, on a spectrum of different kinds of disorders, yet they all have at their core thoughts and fears that impact certain behaviors. Panic disorder, for instance, can be characterized as a fear of fear, primarily being concerned with the physical harm that can result from a panic attack itself. And there's this vicious cycle of thoughts and feelings and symptoms, which I'll talk thoughts of, oh my God, when I'm giving this presentation this afternoon, what if I have a panic attack? And then my heart starts racing, and I start feeling chest tightness, and I think, oh my God, am I having a heart attack? Etc. And there's this spiraling effect that can occur. For people with generalized anxiety disorder, it's more of a diffuse or generalized, almost what the literature characterizes as a heightened vigilance that nevertheless can cause real physical symptoms. We talk about butterflies in the stomach. Well, there is a mind and body link that your GI tract can be impacted by the thoughts and the feelings that we're having. I really like this the triangle, as it's called, the link between thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, because I think it nicely illustrates what's going on. That what we think impacts how we feel and how we act. How we feel impacts what we think and what we do. And what we do impacts what we feel and what we think. So somebody who has a fear of dogs, let's say, will think as they approach a dog, that dog's going to attack me, even though in fact there's no evidence of that. That may cause feelings of nervousness and anxiety. That causes then behavior of avoidance. Avoiding, let's say, a family friend in their house because they have a dog. Or if they see a dog being walked down the street, crossing the street. With respect to fear of public speaking or nervousness or anxiety relating to public speaking, there are all sorts of catastrophic thoughts, which I'll illustrate in a moment, that could then cause emotions and then behaviors, particularly avoidance. And so we think about the impact that can have as a lawyering skill. Somebody who is displaying or is engaging in this avoidance based on their anxiety. Maybe they will too quickly settle a case so as to avoid going to trial. Or will submit an appeal on the papers in writing as opposed to asking for oral argument, even though oral argument may be more effective for the client. So we look at some of the catastrophic or crooked thinking that lawyers litigators who may be appearing in court, particularly for an oral argument or a moot court exercise. If I make a single mistake, the judges will think I'm incompetent. If I screw up this argument, I'll be fired, and then I'll be homeless, and I'll be without a job. If the judge stares at me, it must mean that he or she is thinking negative thoughts about it. And you can imagine how all of these catastrophic, crooked thinking can impact how a person feels, and then, as a result, their behaviors. So when I became Dean of Students, I spent a lot of time working with our counseling center and getting kind of caught up to speed on a lot of the work they did. And I really became interested in cognitive behavioral therapy and that as a treatment mechanism for anxiety. And I'll loop back in the end to show how I've used some of these principles actually in my own teaching in working with primarily first-year law students. So cognitive behavioral therapy, for those who don't know, is a evidence-based treatment for a variety of mental illness. And it's really evidence-based. There's real empirical evidence that shows that it can be an effective treatment for anxiety. And it actually focuses on the treatment, not on the root cause. So it's not about trying to figure out why you're afraid of dogs, even though it probably is because you were bitten as a young child or something like that. The focus is on the here and now and helping the person to overcome that. There's homework involved. There are workbooks devoted to CBT that can teach a person the skill of managing the anxiety. It's a relatively short course of treatment. Folks in our counseling center talk about doing CBT in a 6 to 8 session with students. That includes gradual exposure to the triggers of the anxiety. And it primarily is looking at ways of combating those anxious thoughts with evidence and realistic thinking. This dog, you encounter it, where's the evidence that it's going to attack you? It's wagging its tail and it appears happy. It doesn't appear to be evidence that it actually poses danger. Same thing. The judge who's scowling down at the bench. Does that really mean they think you're incompetent, or is it that they are actually interested in what you're saying? And so that kind of realigning of the thoughts can then get the feelings and the behaviors realigned. So how have I incorporated CBT principles into the classroom? I'm not a therapist, I'm a lawyer, I'm a law professor. I'm not qualified to do a CBT therapy with somebody, nor would I attempt it. However, I think it's important for us as faculty members to be educated about anxiety, particularly since it's so prevalent in law students, and to understand the importance of making referrals to a university counseling center, or to a team of students, or to a counselor at the school, or to outside. One of the things I did as dean of students at St. John's is we actually had a training program for our faculty just on how to make referrals. A student comes in and is talking about being anxious or depressed. How do you then turn that conversation and make an effective referral to a professional? And that's something I would certainly encourage everybody at other schools to implement something similar. So there certainly have been situations where I've encountered students who are really displaying signs and symptoms that it's concerning them, it's concerning me, and I've not hesitated to make that referral to the counseling center. But what I'm talking about here is, are there ways that we can use the principles of CBT to reduce not anxiety, clinical anxiety, but the nervousness that I think all law students would face when they're making their, let's say, their first oral argument in a moot court exercise. And so one of the things that I've done is to educate students in my first year legal writing class about nervousness, about adrenaline and how it can impact, and why your heart races when you're getting ready to make a presentation or an oral argument. To talk about the prevalence of anxiety among law students and lawyers, to basically acknowledge the elephant in the room. I showed the CBT triangle, and we talked briefly about that interrelationship of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And provide opportunities for practice or low-risk exposure. So one of the things I've done is to invite students to say, look, if you're feeling nervous about making a moot court argument, before you have to do it for real, why don't you do it as a practice exercise with me or with a friend? Or why don't we take a walk into the moot court room that we have set up at our school, and so you can see what it feels like, and we can talk about the process that you go through. I of course invite individual discussion with students, and as I said, the importance of making referrals where appropriate. I found students, I do a lot of this education. It's a component of the unit I do on oral argument, It's not all I do. I talk about the rules and the practice and the goals and how to make an effective oral argument. We watch videos of successful and unsuccessful oral arguments. But I've found anecdotally that introducing a 15-minute segment to talk about the elephant in the room, to talk about nervousness that I think most litigators experience at some point in their lives, has been effective. And so the next step in my research that I'd like to do is I'd like to now turn this into an empirical study and to try to measure empirically whether students who receive this kind of generalized instruction about some of these principles, whether they then perceive a comparative difference in the nervousness that they do feel when they're engaged in oral argument. And so speaking of oral argument, I saw my red light is up, and so thank you very much.
Does anyone have any questions for our speakers? Yes.
So I do field placement as well, and I'm thinking obviously a lot of this imagery and getting over anxiety is very applicable to second and third years who are going into field placements. And I guess the question on imagery is I can see how if I can close my eyes and imagine step 1, step 2, step 3 of a surgical procedure and how that would go. How would you encourage students to do imagery for a jury trial or a bench trial where there are a lot of variables you can't predict?
And I think that's a good question. That was one of the things that struck me when I first started getting into this material. In that, but I guess if we're drawing the analogy from the sports realm, that a lot of the studies were looking at sort of the individual sports, archery and figure skating and things that, it's just your own control. But then there was also other ones as well that they looked at performance of table tennis, placement of the shots and things. And so there is the variable of the other side, the opponent. And some of the studies were wrestling in that. So I think what the takeaway is that, and perhaps this dovetails with what we're talking about with anxiety and so forth, is that envisioning yourself as, so if they're going in for a jury trial, if it's their first jury trial, they probably are going to be anxious. So what they're going to do is they're going to rehearse how they're going to go in. And, if they have their opening or the different parts that are memorized. So even though there are all these different moving pieces to it, perhaps all these different balls in the air, that what they can be visualizing and what they can be mentally rehearsing is how perhaps they're going to conduct themselves. And some of the material that's starting to branch out is it's focusing on some of the strategies and so forth. So I understand what you're saying, that you can control some of these things, so how you visualize that, but I think it's taking sort of if we're talking about you're anxious for your first trial, how you're going to try and be calm, how you're going to go about and ask the questions of the witness and so forth.
I think that dovetailing off of the presentation over lunch too, I think encouraging the student and the lawyer to think about, it's easy to say, don't be nervous, and imagine yourself not being nervous. But an easier thing to as well for them to think about is why are they doing this? Why are they engaging in this trial? Well, their client or their supervisor has put their trust in them to do this, and they have the skills and the experience. It's sort of the putting on a smile and you're going to feel happier. Well, thinking about that you're walking into this with the skills and the knowledge and with the trust of your supervisor or client to do this.
Yes.
Not directly courtroom experience, but I found that in giving them an opportunity to make a mini presentation of about 3 or 4 minutes of whatever they think they're going to say, and videotaping that was very helpful in getting us past the problem of not rehearsing. Because you tell them to rehearse or go through this, and oftentimes they won't do it. But if you actually put them up and say, this doesn't count, it doesn't matter, but they're getting familiar with that, and I'm wondering whether you try that with your oral arguments. Just give them sit them in front of the podium, put them on the tape, let them talk for 2 or 3 minutes, just to get the feel of being in the space, and I can find it.
Yeah, no, that's a very good idea, and I have done that on an individual basis, not with all students, but with some of the students who've expressed particular concerns, and then to ask them, okay, how do you think it went? Oh, that went terrible. I stumbled over that answer. I didn't perceive that. I actually thought that was a pretty good answer, and here's what I liked it, and it opens up a discussion about kind of their perceptions versus, as the audience, and they'll say things like, "Oh, but you're really aggressively questioning me." It's like, that's a good thing. I was interested in what you were saying, and so absolutely, and I'm always drawn that the first formal presentation that law students make at many schools is an appellate oral argument. Talk about a very formal, very structured, very stress-inducing experience. I remember when I was in law school at Georgetown, our first kind of presentation was we had to have a quote meeting with our quote supervising attorney, which was the professor, to talk about our research that we being conducted. Yeah, I think those kind of low stress, low time consuming types of opportunities for practice are certainly beneficial.
I think also you make a good point that part of the visualization and some of the other material that we've come across that I didn't touch on today is how it's tied in with memory. So if the students have no context for visualizing and so putting themselves in that physical environment, envisioning how they would respond to questions from the bench or whatnot, that I think it would go in tandem, have them do a practice, not very high stakes, get the feel of it, and then they can take that back. Whether they do it or not on their own is completely optional, but if they are inclined to do that, then they've got the context to do it, so they can then envision themselves. So some of the work is talking about how it's tied to memory, so that you have to look back to experiences that you've had to look forward to visualize, how you will practice it. So I think that's as well.
I just had a question directed to Larry. Based upon what you discussed, I realize I've made many mistakes. I am going to be, in 2 weeks, discussing with my students about oral argument. And I've always dealt with this issue of, I want the reticent students, or what I perceive to be the shy students, I really want them to have the opportunity to practice in the classroom setting, but I'm also very cognizant of putting them on the spot, of dishonoring who they are as people. I've actually said, don't be nervous, and now I realize that's silly to say to someone who's actually very nervous. So how do you deal with that? The reticent student that do you know if they would benefit by practice, even just for the sheer knowledge that they can stand up there and do it, and they're not going to do it in time?
Yeah, and you got to be careful that the practice doesn't itself become, because they're going to say, oh, nothing's really for practice, and you're going to account for this in my grade and so forth. I've tried to do it more individually. Teaching first year legal writing, by the end of the year, you know them pretty well, and I think you know who the shy and reticent students are, and I've tried to kind of seek them out, and one of my colleagues a few years ago had a student with a very, very severe stuttering problem. practice with you individually, or happy to have you work with a court student or things like that. And I took away from that experience as well, kind of that individualized approach. But I've also extended offers to anybody who wants to, I call it a courtroom tour. They said, look, if you want to just spend 5-10 minutes just orienting yourself to the courtroom, I'm happy to, show you walk you around the courtroom and show you this is the podium, this is the microphone, and because they may feel that they're not allowed to do that on their own, and that's often in a way that they've also kind of opened up a little bit. So, I've always been nervous about making speeches. So I try to talk to them a little bit about this really isn't a speech, it's a conversation, and what made you nervous about the speeches in the past. Oh, it was a large room and everybody was looking at me, and I started sweating, and I went back to oral argument as a conversation. I said, look, the only people you're going to see are these 3 people who are up on the bench. The other thing is I've tried to always make the experience when they do the oral argument, always try to make the first experience positive. And so I bring in attorneys from the outside to be the judges, and I talk to the judges that, look, this is not judge for a day. This is not a chance to be the mean judge who's always giving you a hard time. And I talk to them about nervousness and law students, and this is their first time. And I try to also pick attorneys I know who will be passionate, and I always try to make that a positive experience.
Probably get time for one more question.
I guess I'm sort of curious about whether it's the psychology of the students or the psychology of the law school that is, or even of the classroom that's generating the nervousness. I think of this in terms of not an oral argument, but instead just their exam-taking ability and their ability to use facts. I've always wondered, if I gave an exam before they started law school, would they make better fact-based arguments than they make on the exam after they had 14 weeks of law school? I think about how they would make really good fact-based arguments if they were challenging a parking ticket. How they would know to think about the glare of the sun, and the angle of the sign, and whether it was covered by a tree. And I wonder if the same isn't true to some extent with what you're tackling, with the psychology of the student in oral argument, that if you allow them to make an oral argument a week before they started law school, how nervous would they be in that context? Obviously some would be more than others. But I wonder if the median nervousness, obviously the stakes would be different, it's grades and all that, but that's a product of what we're creating, rather than trying to get into the psychology of the student to see what's wrong. And I'm not suggesting that I'm sort of caricaturing that position, but I think it's part of the issue of what have we done to them that makes the nervousness perhaps even more than it was when they said, I'm going to go to law school, where oral argument is kind of part of that shtick, and they enroll, but then all of a sudden, you're exactly right, it's this epidemic by the time the oral argument comes around, that how am I ever going to get through that? It's just sort of a fascinating question to me that's kind of multidimensional as far as what we're adding to it, not just what the student is bringing into the experience.
Yeah, and the studies that I talked about have shown that by the end of the first semester, that anxiety level has increased from baseline of 10% to 30-40%. It's a very interesting question, and I don't have a good answer for it. Certainly, we build up the appellate court in law school. I mean, all they're doing is reading appellate court opinions for the most part. And we sort of elevate the appellate judge onto this. I mean, we actually do elevate the appellate judge, right? Both physically but also professionally. And that may be something that they haven't perceived before they come into law school. It's interesting. One of the things when we talk about what's the next step for this field, law and psychology. You know, part of it, I think, too, is educating our colleagues as well. You know, we've had, you know, I mentioned we brought in some trainers to talk about, you know, working with students who are in a crisis and making referrals and things like that. Part of that is educating faculty about the prevalence of anxiety and depression in law students, and having a discussion about this kind of the chicken and the egg problem. And are there things that we as a community can do to be more supportive and more alert to it? So I think that would be a takeaway as well, at least to have that conversation.
That just made me think of, sorry, just briefly, what we heard this morning, you were saying about would they make a better fact-based argument if you did it before they got into law school. And I find this is a little bit off topic of what we were talking about, that when you give non-law examples, light bulbs start going on. And it made me think of this morning, the talk with the museum and looking at the pictures. The